Hello, it's Heidi Dulabon, international cultural consultant and etiquette expert. We are talking about coffee. Yes, we're going to talk about the history of coffee. Trust me, this is no boring lecture. We are just going to hit some of the highlights with some really cool stories. I think you're going to find it super interesting. Stay tuned. If you drink coffee like I do, stay tuned. You're going to love this. Well, hello. Hey, you're just in time. Grab your coffee. We are going to talk about the history of coffee. I promise you it is going to be fascinating. Absolutely nothing boring here. Truly one of my very favorite subjects. I wrote a dissertation on the history of coffee, sort of as a metaphor for understanding cultural competence, being culturally aware. So stay tuned. I promise I'll make this brief. Coffee. Coffee is a Muslim invention inspired by the Chinese that was spanned the world by Europeans, adopted by Christians, and eventually became a good old cup of American Joe. It is a ride. This story is amazing. So I'm going to give you the brief version of it. I wrote an entire dissertation, as I said, so let's just give you the brief version. If you want more, I will do so much more in the weeds video. But for today, coffee, where did this gorgeous thing come from? Well, there's references, some believe, to coffee in what they believe is coffee in the Old Testament, in the Bible. It's been around for thousands of years. And a great story, probably a myth, but who cares? It's a great story. About 1,000 years ago, in what is present-day Ethiopia, in the Kaffa region, lived a young goat herder, and he loved to take his flute and play his flute when he was herding his goats. And one day he's herding the goats, playing his flute, and he hits a bad note, and the goats go crazy and they run further up the mountain, and he's chasing them, and he finds them, and the goats are chewing on these berries, and he looks, and the goats are up on their hind legs dancing and going crazy. And he thought, oh my gosh, what's happened to my goats? I'm going to be in big trouble. He finally calms the goats down, herds them back home. He thinks, oh my gosh, I'm going to go out tomorrow and the goats are going to be dead. No, he wakes up the next day and the goats are great, but they're raring to go, and they run back up the mountain to the exact same spot. And he says, well, heck, they didn't die. Maybe I should have a bite. What are they chewing? And he starts chewing, and it was the coffee cherry, and he gets a little tingling through his body, and by gosh, that's the birth of coffee. So we are in Ethiopia, not just the birthplace of mankind, the birthplace of our beloved coffee. So then what happens to coffee? Well, coffee starts getting discovered, and there's a lot of slave trade routes going on right now. And they start making I think it's the very first energy bar. They take a little fat and a bunch of spices, and they put in these coffee cherries. And they put these in these, roll them up, and they had these balls, these energy balls that you could be transport with them. They were preserved. You didn't have to be, of course, refrigerated. We're talking, 1,000 years ago. And so they're eating these things, and the slaves, and they're moving people back and forth, and they go down to the Arabian Peninsula, and people are there, and they start finding these things, and it starts traveling, and they take with them some of the plants, and things start growing. And then there is this lovely mystical sect of Muslims called Sufis. Yes, they were the whirling dervishes. And these Sufis were just a lovely, learned group of men. Now, they were not a cloistered religious group. They were tradesmen. They had shops. They traveled. They would go home to their families at night. But the Sufis had these religious ceremonies called didkars, and it required these Sufis, the whirling dervishes, to be up all night long with these religious ceremonies. And they're thinking, gosh, this is all great, I'm into it, but I got to stay awake. Well, they realized that these coffee cherries from the Kaffa region of Ethiopia that had come through the trade routes, they thought, oh my gosh, this stuff is helping us stay awake at night. And then in the 13th century, the Chinese, yes, they show up. They have these treasure fleets, the 7 treasure fleets, where the Chinese were sending out fleets of ships trying to learn things. They wanted to learn more about plants and medicine. And in those days, the Muslims were great physicians. And so they knew that the Sufis were a very learned sect. So they contact the Sufis and say, hey, we'd like to take a few of you guys back with us to China. We're working on an observatory, and I bet you could probably help us. And the Sufis, very generous people, said, sure, we'll come help you. We'll go to China. So they sail back to China. And while they're there learning and helping the Chinese, they are also learning, and they have a look and they say, hey, what's going on? Look at the Chinese. They have these leaves called tea leaves, and the Chinese, well, we're eating these berries. Every now and then we'll roast them in a pan over fire and eat them. But look what they're doing with these leaves. They're taking the leaves and they're steeping them. They're putting them in boiling water. And then they're drinking this thing. Heck, and they have little tiny porcelain cups that were very white, by the way, inside to show up the color of the Chinese tea, and no handles, just the little Chinese teacups that you commonly still see today in some Chinese restaurants. And so the Sufis say, hey, those our berries we've been, just maybe heating up in the pan and eating? Well, let's put them in boiling water. Let's get back home. So the Sufis sailed back home and said, hey, everybody, we've got a whole new way to deal with the kaffa, which is what they called the coffee. And so they start roasting them and then putting them in boiling water. And guess what we're drinking today? Thank you, Sufis. The Sufis, we owe so much to the Sufis. Because if they had been a cloistered sect, coffee may never have left the walls of their monasteries. No, they grew coffee. Some did live in monasteries, but most were going home at night to families, and they were tradespeople. They were very learned. They were going throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and they're taking coffee with them. Yes, and so coffee spread all throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And they said, we live here. The Sufis lived in Yemen, in the country of Yemen. And they thought, we might be able to make some money off this. And then the next thing, the Ottomans come in and they take over. And now we are in Yemen, and we are specifically in the port of Mocha. Mocha isn't a coffee drink. Mocha's not chocolate. Mocha is a port city in the country of Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula. And for 150 years, Mocha was the port. It had it going on, exporting things. And so the Ottomans now have taken over this Sufi drink. They're in control. And they said, we have got something here. We are going to grow plenty of this, and we are not going to let any of it leave. No, this is something else. We will export the beans, the coffee beans, but no green beans, because they could grow them, and no plants can escape. That's it. We have to control this. So then Yemen went through something called akin to the California gold rush. They had a coffee rush, and they start bringing in farmers, and they terrace the mountains that were perfect for growing coffee in the mountains of Yemen. And so they're growing coffee like crazy, and the Ottomans are saying, this is all good. We will roast them here so you cannot grow them a green bean. And then we're sending out coffee in all kinds of different containers, but no plants. And if a plant left or any green beans were smuggled, it was terrible what happened to you. You just wouldn't go there. And by now, the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, the great mariners, the great tradespeople, they are sailing into the port of Mocha, and they are taking this and they are selling coffee throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And so we're all loving this, and this is working out great because the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, they were trading spices, and this coffee was a natural load to put on their ships to start selling this. But the Ottomans, no, nothing can leave. We absolutely have to control this. There's too much money going on and power. So what happens? Well, it goes up the headquarters, the seat of the Ottoman Empire was in Constantinople. Yes, well, that is modern day Istanbul, of course, and things start happening there. But back in Mocha, people kept trying to smuggle things out. And there was an Indian. He was from India, but he was a Muslim, and his name was Baba Budan. And Baba said, I've got to get this back to India. We've got to grow this. And he smuggled out 7 green coffee bean seeds on his stomach. He somehow got them secured to his stomach, and 7 is significant in Islam, so he felt like that was okay. And so he escapes, and he successfully gets to southern India, to Mysore. And the coffee grown in southern India today, one of the top 10 producers of coffee in the world, came from Baba. It's Baba, and now the region where the coffee is called Baba Budangiri. So that's a cool story. So then eventually plants did escape, and coffee was then transported around not just the Arabian Gulf and the Muslim world, but it made its way into Europe, into Holland, and from there it made all kinds of journeys around the world. And it is just such a fascinating story. The Dutch are still one of the top drinkers of coffee per capita in the world today. And it just makes sense because they were very instrumental in helping coffee move around the world. And so they too were able to smuggle out some coffee plants from Mocha. And they said, okay, we're going to get this to Holland, and we're going to start trying to grow some coffee. Well, it didn't grow very well there. And so they decided, you know what, we've got to take it to some of our colonies. And so they take it to sail with it to some of their colonies. And a really cool story is that how coffee was so big in Amsterdam, and now we are all the way at the court of Louis XIV. And if you follow my channel, I have a thing for Louis XIV. Okay, we're talking Versailles. Why I have a thing for him is because he really took what the Italian Renaissance did for etiquette and manners, and Louis XIV just kicked it up, and so much of today's modern manners come from Louis XIV. Well, Louis XIV was crazy about coffee. He loved it. And so one of the top officials in Amsterdam said, okay, we are going to give Louis XIV a gift. And so they took a gift to him. It was a coffee plant. And so they arrived in Versailles, and they arrived with this coffee plant, and a very fancy, beautiful greenhouse was erected just for these coffee plants, and the coffee plants grew, and they did very well. And that was in 1669. And so then coffee is now part of the whole diplomatic world. There are some ambassadors now going around the world, and there's all these different kinds of wars and things, and so right now we are in 1669, and we're at Versailles, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire wants to send coffee and a letter through his ambassador to Louis XIV in Versailles. And so Louis XIV says, well, of course, I'll receive your ambassador. And so the ambassador sets out from the Ottoman Empire, and he's working his way to France. And meanwhile, Louis XIV says, well, what the heck am I going to wear? I've got to have all kinds of robes made. They've got to be bejeweled. I want really cool headdresses. I want feathers. I want the whole thing. I want to receive this Sultan's ambassador looking great. So this ambassador arrives in July, but Louis XIV, the new wardrobe's not done. So what happens? This poor ambassador is just hanging out. He's just hanging out, and he's got all this coffee with him, and he's entertaining people, and they go crazy about him. They go crazy about coffee. And meanwhile, Louis XIV is just waiting for this wardrobe. Finally, okay, the guy arrived in July. Finally, by December, Louis XIV's outfits are finally ready. And so he comes out dressed to the nines, and the ambassador comes to meet him, and the ambassador is in a very, very simple robe, a little nod to what the Sufis wore, our friends the Sufis. And Louis XIV is like, what the heck? Are you kidding me? This is how you show up to meet me? And he said, you should stand at the name of the Sultan, sends his greetings and a letter. And Louis XIV was so incensed at this, he thought, lack of respect. He said, I'm not taking this letter. I'm not standing up at the name of the Sultan. You know what? You can just forget it. This is just not working. And the ambassador was to befriend France, because the Ottoman Empire wanted to keep moving and take over more and more of Europe. And so Louis XIV says, I really don't care. I just don't care. Look at me. I'm all ready. I'm all set, whatever. So it just does not go well. And then as the Ottoman Empire is moving and moving and moving, and finally, they come to the Gates of Vienna, and if you watch my croissant story, now we're in Vienna, and it's this huge, the battle for Vienna in 1683, and it's the bakers saved the day. The Ottomans are fighting, and there's this wonderful Polishman. He was helping the Austrians. He's helping the Viennese, but he was a little darker skinned, and they said, he said, I could pass for one of the Turks. I'm going to go behind enemy lines and find out what's going on. And he helped save the day. And the bakers who heard that the Turks were tunneling under the city gates, all these people came together and they saved the day. And as a reward to this lovely Pole, his name was Kolschitsky, as a gift to him, they said, you can have any of the spoils, because the Viennese won, the Austrians won, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks just had to take off, and it was the demise of the Ottoman Empire. And they left coffee beans, but because our new friend Kolschitsky had been to that part of the world, he knew what these bags that were left behind by the Turks, and he said, oh my gosh, those are coffee beans. He said, you keep your gold. I want these coffee beans. And he started one of the first coffee houses in Vienna, and it was called the Blue Bottle. So cool story. Okay, so Louis XIV, so what happened? So how did, it keep moving, the coffee? So, well, with all the Europeans sailing and coffee plants now, and coffee, everybody's drinking coffee, and now we got to keep getting it further south. And so what happens? Well, Louis XIV, our friend, has died, and it's about 1720, and now Louis XV, he's a 10-year-old kid, okay? And he lets a plant from this greenhouse. Remember the greenhouse with the plant. Louis XIV, it was such an honor to have this coffee plant. It was so taken care of in this greenhouse. Well, that Louis XV let a little plant go. with this lovely man who was going to sail, a sailor, and he was going to take this to the New World, to some of the colonies, to Martinique, 4,000 miles away, Declare. Well, so he's sailing, and he has this little coffee plant that he is nurturing, and it is a tale in itself. It's a whole video, and there's pirates, and there's terrible water, and there's rationing of little bits of water, and this man rationed his own personal water to keep this plant alive, and now the plants throughout most of Central America came from that plant that was on that ship. All that journey kept alive by this man rationing his own water. The Portuguese, the great sailors, they bring coffee to Mexico and to all throughout South America, to Brazil, which is by far for 150 years, they have been the largest coffee producers in the world, Brazil, and that's where that came from. So this has just been an amazing story throughout all the ages. And it gets to the coast of the United States through all the mariners bring it, and they're drinking tea though, But then what happened in 1773? The Boston Tea Party. And so the Americans thought, we're not drinking tea with those Brits, we're done with them. We're going to start drinking this thing called coffee. And coffee just sort of took off from the American Revolution through the Civil War, and after World War II, it really became popular. And we have, Starbucks and everything else now. And who doesn't start their day with coffee? I want to tell you so much more. I want to tell you about the German poet and writer Goethe. Yes, he was instrumental in the scientific discovery of caffeine. I want to tell you about that. I want to tell you about coffee houses, that the first coffee house was outside of the Muslim world, they were the precursor to Starbucks today, was throughout Arabia. I've got to tell you all about it, but to be respectful of your time, drop me a comment, please. Let me know you'd like to hear more, because I'm dying to tell you the whole history of coffee houses, when women were admitted. Okay, thanks to the Italians. Thank you very much, Italians. I want to tell you more about caffeine. What a story. I want to tell you much more. So please, if you'd like to know any more about the history, if you'd like to know about the etiquette and how the different cultures handle coffee, I'd love to tell you. Please drop me a comment. I'm dying to tell you. Can you tell? Okay, I'm going to enjoy this lovely cup of coffee, and I wish you a marvelous rest of your day. I hope it's filled with many cups of coffee. And as I always say, you're just awesome. You are an awesome person for listening. I hope you're as excited about this as I am. Thank you. And as I always say, please be kind. Thank you.